So the first questions, what are the key risks factors for lameness in extensive systems? Can we start with Nick?
Okay, thank you. And I want to say I don't feel an expert on extensive grazing system, but we work with around 90 farms in the UK that graze. And it's important to say there are different types of grazing farm and grazing systems. So in the UK, we would have what we call the Kiwi style, the New Zealand style, spring block grazing, where the cows are spending 9, 10, 11, sometimes 12 months of the year out on pasture. So I do work with some of those, but I also work with the other extreme with fully housed. And I would say in the UK, the majority of the milk comes from fully housed cows, but the majority of farms still graze to some degree. And that grazing can be from just 6 months of the year through to 12 months of the year. So the risk factors are obviously going to be very different according to whether they are the very, very extensive grazing or something that's a little bit of a hybrid. But if we take the very extensive grazing system, then it's clearly dealing with the climatic extremes at either end of the year and sometimes in the middle of the summer that's the big challenge. And so it really comes down to the track quality, and most of the time that's the biggest determinant of foot health on those herds. Track quality, gateway quality, poaching around water troughs, and then to some degree the standing times and the handling in and around the collecting yards. And those would be the big areas that we'd focus on in terms of risk factors on farm.
Beautiful.
Vamos, Juan. Different, for example, in South America, Colombia, some countries in Central America, we only have grazing system, extensive system, distance on topics that we'll talk later.
Yeah. Majority of my work has been on intensive. But yes, I worked some in South America, Central America, Costa Rica, and Uruguay, mostly, a little bit in Brazil. And there, the thing is that compared to what Nick was saying, there it's full-time grazing all year round. What I saw, interesting, different diseases, things that were not important are now important, but that I think Juan can explain very well, much better than me. And one point Nick mentioned, of course, the tracks. It's very important, the quality of the tracks, but also the management regarding, I remember one Uruguay vet who was saying to carry the cows to the parlor needed an old gaucho with a lazy horse.
Yes.
So now some are going with twats, pushing the cows, and this makes a difference. For that, there is an expert, I don't remember very well his name, from New Zealand that has fantastic videos.
Neil Chesterton.
Neil Chesterton. I recommend to you to get through these videos. It's very good.
Yeah.
And the fact that the extensive system economically has been very much based in the low expenses, low cost, compared to the intensive system that is putting big assets to get a return, not just in food, but in many things. So the only big asset in the extensive system has been land, but sometimes they forget to invest in parlors, so they put more and more cows, so they increase the land to take neighbors. But they maintain the same parlors, so sometimes cows have to stand or to wait or even to lie in the holding pen. What is a big risk factor? That's what from I learned, especially in Uruguay.
Maybe I pick up on that point because we get some Kiwi, some New Zealand workers coming across to the UK to work occasionally, and it's really noticeable the superior cattle handling skills that we see with the Kiwi workers. They've got the understanding that you've got to go steady, no heads up in the collecting yard. Do you understand that? So if the cows are in the collecting yard, they need space in the collecting yard to reorder. And if you've got the heads coming up above the rumps of the cows, that's meaning that the cows are being too packed in. And I often talk about, we see this thing called backing gate disease. That happens across any system, I know, but it's really noticeable in the grazing system when we've got backing gate disease and the cows are being pushed too hard with the backing gate, and yet you see a lot of white lines in those scenarios.
Juan, do you have any information you want to share with us?
Okay. Okay. This is, we have the 3 questions. See?
Yeah, go on.
Yeah, go for it.
Pictures. It's perfect.
You want to switch to the second question?
Wait.
Go. I think Juan's got some photos.
Yeah,
Okay. Risk factors
he was
in-
gonna,
Risk fac- yeah,
exactly.
Extensive system. In our experience, distance to the milking parlor, and maybe we have in Colombia and South America 5 kilometers.
How
Go
many?
to the
5 kilometers?
maybe 5 kilometers, maybe 3, 2, but the distance is a huge risk factor for us. I mean, it's the same in New Zealand, I think, in Australia. See, yeah. Something to.
Sí, así tú
That's good.
¿Qué prefieres hacer toda tu presentación?
No, discutiendo.
Okay. But, funny thing, in the big commercial intensive operations, the bigger they are, the more distance they have to walk cows. One time I was in California with David Bem. He was trimming in one farm on sand bedding that they had to move from 3 milkings to 2 milkings because those cows were unable to get 3 times to the parlor. Because at the end, 5 kilometers easily can make 1 cow in an intensive confined system. We try to be controversial, isn't it?
Yeah, it's fine.
To make fun, no?
So let's move on to the next question.
No, we are talking
Where's
about
the-
the risk factors.
Sorry for the questions.
Sorry for the question. Continue.
Another thing that we have, it is very common in extensive system, is moisture plus distance. So it get the soil very thin. The soil involvement is the main problem for us. Because the hoof is hygroscopic. Can you explain for them? That the capacity for retain
You have explained.
water or humidity, and it makes the corn soften. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. The result is thin soils.
There's a question.
Do you
now.
have?
About 5 kilometers. 5 kilometers
A day.
and they
A day. Maybe 2.5 to go to the milking parlor and coming
and
again.
you don't try to put it in the middle of the field, and get the division of the
Es lo que tú explicabas, es
Ya está,
difícil.
ya está, ya. Okay. Okay.
There, because what we do in Chile, we try to maximum 1 kilometer all the fields for the.
It's not going through.
Okay.
Yeah.
What we try to do in Chile is put the parlor close to the old fields, so they have to walk maximum 1 kilometer. So don't you
Doesn't
do
matter.
that in Colombia?
Sorry. Doesn't matter. A law of the economy
Ajá.
is the farmer must grow and must become bigger to maintain the income. So no matter you put in the middle, of course, must put in the middle of your parlor, you are increasing the size of your farm. Your farm is becoming bigger to get the same money because the margin of the milk and the beneficial margin makes to you to grow. And as soon as you grow, this happens in New Zealand and everywhere, you get to the distance. But this limiting factor, as I meant, is the same in intensive farming. The way of having big farms is with big distances. There is no other way. And then it is proven that milking more often is more efficient in the intensive system.
Any other question?
Those tracks where they crown at the beginning and now they're flatter, so crown more drainage where it doesn't store the water, holds the water in the
Please
ground.
use your microphone, otherwise I cannot translate.
like on that track, was that track originally had a crown and now it's flat so it holds all the moisture in?
Posición. De todo, hay de todo.
No, David. In this case, it's concrete. It's just concrete, yes. Plus moisture and manure and rain and.
Another similarity between both system, intensive and extensive, is that there are good farms and bad farms.
I'm just wondering, how big are the farms? How many cows are we talking about when they have to walk 2.5 kilometers?
¿Cuál es el tipo de vaca de granjas, de tamaño? ¿Cuántas vacas tienen?
Ah, okay. No, it's in my country. I'm talking about Colombia. Maybe 300, the maximum quantity of cows. It's not too big, not too big farms. But in New Zealand or
in your experience in UK, how big are the extensive farms?
The biggest I'm aware of is 1,600. But you know, that's about as big as it gets, really. Most of the ones we work with would be 200 or 300. Just to add on that distance, there's one farm I work with where they have a mobile milking bale, and actually they move the milking parlour to the cows. It's not a common system, but having seen it, you realise how much problem comes from walking cows on concrete and on hard surfaces, because those cows, you know, apart from the occasional foul in the foot or interdigital necrobacillosis, you know, they hardly get any foot problems. So I wasn't there in my foot health capacity.
Nice. Juan.
Okay. Another risk factor is lack of trimming. I don't know why some producers or some farmers think that the cow doesn't need trimming, preventive trimming, and the lack of trimming traducing in the results is abnormal forces, long toes, shift the bearing to the heels, and inappropriate bearing balance or bearing area.
So Juan, we're getting ahead of the game a little bit here. The next question, even though we're touching a little bit here. So, is preventive good or bad for these extensive situations?
Hoof trimming, yes or not?
Yes.
What do you
preventive
think?
On a, you tell me.
Can I be a bit controversial here?
Okay.
I think in the really well-managed extensive system, you don't need preventative trimming.
You don't?
No. If the management is very good and you've got staff trained to do lameness detection well, then focusing on what we call the lame and overgrown, I think you refer to them as the ugly feet. I like that term, Adrian. But you know, in the very well-managed herds, then you can get away with no preventative trimming, and as long as you're disciplined and focused on the lameness detection and picking up cows that are overgrown and poorly shaped.
What about with drier farms? Do you have any experience? Juan?
Yes. I mean, in my experience, the top of the prevention is put the cow in the chute 8 to 3 weeks before first calving, because you reach a good angle, and if you have a good angle, after that, the suspensory apparatus and everything will work very good. And
I've been a few times years ago working, mostly consulting, some hands-on little bit, in Uruguay. The 100% extensive system. What I found, the biggest issue I could find, groups of heifers that were introduced to milking, first lactation. They had to get made to work for long distances, get back, wait for a long time to get milk, and then getting 3-4 kilos of concentrate in the parlor to complete the ration. and then having huge, what is no more fashion to say something like kind of acute laminitis or something like that, with very thin soles, very much related with what he mentioned, I presume, humidity also, and the poor quality of the tracks, and all these risk factors we mentioned before. And in these animals, I hardly can believe that intensive trimming, pre-calving trimming, could be a help, could be a tool to minimize that. And it's much more about farming management, the question, especially if the milk price in this time was something in between 8 and 13 cents a dollar, 1 liter. And in that time, American farmers were getting 30 cents. So tell to this man, he must expend some extra money. The value of one heifer there was $300. So if this heifer was getting lame, they were putting apart. She was recovering okay, and if not okay also. No? So for me, it's very difficult. And from the experience I had little bit in France, and in France, especially in North, there are French people here. There is a good experience of a much more bastard-based system. And I do not think in many of them, or maybe in one of them, some preventive hoof trimming system. Once I was in Ireland with the Irish Hoof Trimmers Association, and there typically one hoof trimmer was going to 8-10 farms to fix lame cows. But it's not usual to do trimming as a massive thing, as a prevention tool in the extensive, I think, from what I learned. And for me, it makes sense. Well, it doesn't mean that we must take care of many cows much more. As he presented in his picture, this cow needs trimming.
Yes.
But probably it doesn't justify the investment in trimming all the herd as much as is done in the intensive systems.
But she probably needed trimming 3 months ago, 6 months ago. Long, yes.
2 lactations ago.
I think 5 years ago.
This probably cow probably, I am very classical for that. Now fashions are now comfort, now nutrition, I don't know. I am with Grinu and the chronic laminitis. She is chronic laminitic cow. And these cows need frequent trimming. Is the only treatment they can have. They are already losers in the...
And a little difference here in the way to trim this kind of cows is you have to be careful with the thin soles.
Yeah.
Maybe sometimes it's just the long and improve a little bit the angle, but...
There is your business. Trim little many times.
Yes, more money.
And get well paid. Because you must choose the cow. It's not putting all the cows on there. You can get a lower payment. If you trim this cow and that cow, you need more money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I ought to say, I'm a big advocate of preventative trimming in most scenarios. And I'm deliberately being a little bit challenging and controversial because, I do see these scenarios where we're probably trying to do too much with the very extensively grazed herds when we're trying to fix problems that aren't there. But I totally agree with Juan. The time to get the foot in its best possible shape is that time before calving. And so the pre-dry foot check, for me, is still a very useful thing to go through, but it shouldn't be the point at which we're fixing problems that should have been dealt with throughout lactation. And I guess that's the point I'm trying to make. If you're fixing cows as they're being dried off, there's a problem that should have been fixed earlier.
Yeah, another problem that we have is with lame cows. When we trim therapeutic lame cows, is a little different, or the recovery of that cows are slow because the cow has to walk long distance and then put the hoof putting or into the mud, and the no healthy toe is with 100% touching, and the recovery is a little bit difficult for us.
Another point, probably people like you and some here that must work in both systems, is the farmer again. I like very much to talk about farmer genetics. Among intensive farmers, it's years and years, there is a movement of educating them, and they are very much aware that food are a real issue. So there is a good cooperation between trimmer and farmer in putting money and in putting efforts in that. Instead, in the extensive farmer is much more educated in the low cost and the non-spending, and probably in many of these farmers, the idea that lameness is an issue is not so much introduced, and this is the reason he finds these kind of things that we do not find anymore in the intensive farms. So it's much more a matter of mentality that makes it difficult to introduce, I shouldn't say trimming everything, but trimming more often what he needs, investing more effort in that, you know? And there comes to me one point. Why I am sitting here if they are working on extensive, and me, I've been working worldwide. One, I presume, because I've been the boss of this organization, so I decided to be here. And the second one is probably because recently I've been consulting for the biggest world operation, farming operation in the world, that is in Saudi Arabia, Al Morai. And recently I got retired, and that's Nick who has started doing this work of consulting, and we have been discussing in the bus. And we both agree that this big operation that are milking 4 times a day, these animals that are in this kind of coral cool system that take a lot of room because cows have no free stalls, no cubicles. And they can lie however they want. It's almost perfect. They have air conditioning because they have oil, so they can spend as much money. So the risk factors are very well addressed, as could be a fantastic northern island, New Zealand Northern Island good farm, where everything is perfect, you know? We seldom find lame cows, and he said the main issue is the reaction to the MD vaccine. Imagine around maximum 10% of incidence of lameness events in the year. Finding all cows working fantastic because the rate, growth, and wear included the importance of disease that is null, gives to us to the same conclusion. Hardly can justify the intensive trimming, and it is done there. But this is the same, it's happening, some have been here, in San Jose farm here, with 6,000 cows, an average of 46 kilos per cow, that are milking 3 times. We have been trimming there systematically from heifers for many years. And now, our trimmers for ANKA, we make a smaller income, we make money from training the in-farm worker, and we make money from getting every certain time, spending a couple of days or so, just trimming sorted cows. And pathology doesn't change. So be aware of that. Times are changing. Technical management has arrived much before to the cropping system. Think that the first one that introduced robotic milking was a company that was not involved in the dairy business as Lely, because these people in the farming system have so many things in the tractor. Everything is under control, and this is coming to the dairy industry little by little, the early detection, and probably more and more farms have to be treated this way. We know by the moment the situation general for pasture, as he says, and non-pasture is that farmers do not trim enough, do not take enough care. But this is changing, and probably in one time, the more you address risk factors, the less massive trimming can have an influence.
Anything to add, David, with your slides, Juan?
Type of floors, we talk about that. Transition is very important here. Because the como el levante, grazing, el levante, cuando están más grandes de terneras.
Pues,
Levante.
Levante, eso es colombiano, tío.
Heifers.
Heifers. Maiden heifers.
Okay. Heifers are 100% in the pasture, and then before the first calving, okay, go to the tracks, go to the concrete, go to the hard and abrasive surfaces, and this is a very common problem. Soil hemorrhage, just the transition to heifers to first calving.
Juan, what can we do as hoof experts to train these cattle owners? How do we get ahead of the game? How do we teach them like intensive systems?
No?
Excuse me?
Juan, how do we get ahead of the game? How do we train these cattle owners?
How to train?
Yes, how do we train the
¿Cómo
owners?
convencer a los granjeros que tienen que hacer que el sistema intensivo darle importancia?
¿Cómo nos adelantamos con ellos?
Difficult.
¿Qué marketing? ¿Qué?
No, I mean it's just show results. When you do trimming, prevention trimming, and show results for the farmer and decrease. For example, I had farms with 25% of lameness to 3% of lameness. It's just showing results and good hoof trimming.
Can I quickly pick up on that point about heifers coming off grass and into the dairy facility? We see this so much in the UK, and it's really highlighted the differences in the way heifers are managed around the world. I look to the US colleagues here and Canadian colleagues to sort of comment on this as well. But we often face this situation where heifers come off grass straight into transition and then into the milking facility, and then we get massive bruising. And where we can get some degree of exposure to hard walking surfaces, concrete, in a month or two, preferably 2 or more before calving, the difference to those heifers coming in is vast. And we can perhaps draw on some of the work that's been done on the digital cushion, the fat pad sat inside the hoof capsule, and realize actually some degree of exposure to hard walking surfaces before first calving can be hugely protective for those heifers coming in. And I wondered if there are any comments from anyone on that, whether they've seen that. Yeah, that's always the first question I get when I talk to this. How long do we need to have that exposure? And you know, I always float the idea of 2 months, but it is a case of I don't think we know the answer to that, and some exposure is better than none.
So when they are heifers, you expose them for 2 months before calving.
Before first calving. But you know, I don't know if 3 months is better than 2, or whether 1 month is enough. But my guess is 1 month probably isn't enough. 2 months is pretty good, and 3 months would be amazing.
Because we see this very often in Argentina. We also have grazing system, but we also have a confined system, a compost barn, and also freestall, and some dry lots that they are not dry when it starts raining. And we pass through many problems, many troubles, white line disease, soil abscess. And Roger Bloway came once in 2012 to Argentina, and he recommended that. So your recommendation is to put the heifers 2 months?
If you can.
If someone can
recommend
something else, I don't know, Adrian or Juan?
Not answering exactly to your question. I think it's a technical aspect I couldn't say. In the intensive, it's the same thing. if cows must go to cubicle, it's better getting these heifers made to the cubicle and freestyle before getting to lactation. Otherwise, they have to get made to too many things. So again, we find parallelism between both, and maybe they are not so different, both systems. So we have seen two things here. There are fantastic herds in both systems, and there are ugly herds in any system. But you know the problem. The only way to make working our work is in cooperation with the main point there, that is the farmer. And what happens is, most of the time, the farmer that needs the least to you is the one who is willing the most having you, and just in case, expending some money. So instead, the farm that has these ugly cows he's presenting, usually it's a farmer that is not willing to spend the money that he really needs to. No matter it's intensive or extensive. We see examples. For instance, I've been consulting for close to 20 or 15 years in Saudi Arabia. I was unable to say them, go for a better quality trimming, don't get so much dust, sort your cows, choose. I don't say less trimming, I say much more well-focused trimming, and if one cow needs to be trimmed 4 times a year, do it, and instead maybe another one doesn't need at all. But these good farmers, because these Saudi Arabia are fantastic, and we have this kind, say, you know, let it stay. I prefer spending my money, come here to eat, just don't cause harm to my cow. She doesn't need much, just check and go. And instead you have the neighbor that he says, no, they are quite okay. You get there, when she got lame 2 months ago, and he's calling now. And I think it's the same case you have in Colombia, but in many more producers, no?
Another question from Gerard.
Not a question, but a comment, a Nick's comment about like teaching heifers before calving. So they've actually done that in New Zealand. There's they did 5 weeks before calving. They put them on like a standing pad to give them exposure to the concrete. And there was no difference when they did it, right? So it's hard, like I think maybe the timing happens, but I think Adrian's point, it's so specific to certain farms, right? We do it on some farms and it doesn't matter, and other farms it does. But there are some data to say that when we put them on concrete, it doesn't really matter, so.
That was 5 weeks, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was 5 weeks. So is the timing right? We don't know, right? So but I think it illustrates the point, right? There's so many different variables. Like Adrian's point is, the good farms probably don't have problems. The other farms, what do we need to do for them, right? Fine, like I agree, that cow probably would have benefited, but some other farms, no, right? So I think it's strategic to it.
Yeah.
Any other comment? No? Let's move on.
No, just this is the first question. Difference in types of lameness between both systems. In our experience, the main disease is white lines. Yes, white lines. You know, the separation of the white line in the heel, mostly in the lateral toes. Lack of trimming again. Repetitive trauma because the distances, many steps, trauma, and if you have imbalance in heels, it results in white lines. This is the most common disease in our researches.
Let me switch gears a little bit. So Juan is saying that he's finding white lines in extensive systems. What are you guys finding in intensive operations? Can someone share their experience?
Same thing.
Same thing.
Also,
Same thing.
Same thing.
So we can see that there's not a lot of difference.
Exactly this picture.
Yeah.
and sole ulcers.
And the sole ulcers.
White line, thin soles.
Thin soles,
Yeah, and the challenge with thin soles is that you often end up with a herd of thin soles.
The only difference I found was working in Costa Rica with Impro. Fernando, you remember Fernando? There are producers, and this is Central America, this is a tropical climate. What he said, a lot of moisture, no? Is that they were claiming that in the white line, in the axial white line, they were having trouble. Should you trim there? I say, never. We never pay attention to that in our system, no? Never, never. After working for a few days, I was saying, better shut up. Lot of white line problems in the axial side. I cannot make statistics, but it was very characteristic of the pasture-based system in the Central America countries. This we
like
don't
this.
find with this frequency, very seldom sometimes.
Like this, Adrian. Axial fissures is like a white line, but actual in the actual
It's a white
region.
line.
Yes, it's a white line. Yes, but here with corion protrusion here and
It's very difficult to heal.
very difficult. Yes. This is
Zaire,
a
give us your
headache.
comment, please.
I don't know, you guys, if you are going to speak about the infectious lesions, but I don't know if you are going to speak about the infectious lesions, but how do you guys live with infectious lesions if you guys place a footbath or something like that?
In extensive system, thanks God, we don't have many infectious diseases like the digital dermatitis or maybe phlegmons.
Phlegmons.
Yes, because the moisture.
In Brazil.
But yeah, I don't know how useful is put hoof baths for that. Maybe for prevention, but for foot rots.
Yeah, and I tend to advocate at least weekly foot bathing to control the phlegmon, but yeah, we try and advocate more frequent foot bathing, particularly with our part house, part grazed systems to control the digital dermatitis. So frequency is key to that.
But in extensive system, digital dermatitis is not very common.
I could see some in Uruguay, some digital dermatitis very much under control without doing nothing. It was not a matter of putting pressure on that. There were real issues, especially with heifers, as you would say, from Argentina and the space. And I was blaming the concentration of animals for a long time in the holding pen. Sometimes they had to stay there for 4 hours, no? But not significant.
If you're going to concentrate your efforts particularly with fowl or a phlegmon, interstitial necrobacillosis, whatever you're calling it, then in your first few months, first month or two after calving is where you're going to get your biggest return on effort and investment for that. Obviously, you can get fowls at any time in a lactation, but it's that time around calving is the crucial time.
Another disease is very common is toe ulcer or toe necrosis.
Juan, in the slide of axial fissure, you put lack of trimming. Where, in which category you find more heifers, first calving, or you find also in cows? Because
in cows.
More in cows?
More in cows, yes. Yes, okay. Because lack of trimming results in long toes and more fissure. But I mean, in heifers, you don't find a lot of.
I presume that Toussaint Ravel already said in his book in the 70s. He was just defining and explaining all the trimming regarding, let's say, in general, two diseases, no dermatitis, or let's say environmental diseases, and laminitis. That is no more fashion to tell that, but we all understand what is chronic laminitis. That is a melt of things or risk factors, and let's say comfort, lack of comfort. And what we see is that laminitis is a chronic disease that, of course, appears in older cows. So I think it's maybe the speed of development is what changes. In very well-managed farms, no matter one system or other, this chronic laminitis, for instance, in Saudi Arabia, appears in very old cows, 6, 7 lactations, that generally in this system that there is a big turnover of animals, they are no more in the herd for other reasons. So instead, in the average farms, no matter it's extensive or intensive, the younger the chronic laminitis appears, the more important is the preventive trimming, because it's the only treatment existing. The election treatment for chronic laminitis that leads to unbalancing is rebalancing. So, to the question, trimming or not trimming in extensive or intensive, should I say more? What does this farm need? If it has many lame cows, probably for sure, making an intensive trimming pays very well. If the least lameness he has, the more controversial is deciding what is the right. But no worry, the hoof trimmer is making his way and making his business. I've seen these Irish trimmers, and they were making a beautiful work, trimming in a selected way. So it's about that, I think.
Mariano, another thing is I found this kind of problem also in Brahman cattle. I don't know if you have Brahman in heifer, in young animals, but in Brahman cattle. It's Bradford, 100% in pasture, and you find in young animals this condition.
No, but we also find that in Holstein.
In Holstein?
Juan, would you say that there's difference within breeds?
I mean, yes. In jerseys, because the low angle in jerseys, some of them present this kind of axial fissures. Another disease here is toe ulcer. Every day we have more problems with toe problems.
Yes, it's true. In Costa Rica, I had plenty of jerseys.
And toe ulcers has two conditions: overwear and overtrimming. This is the
And both together sometimes.
Yeah. My good friend Roger Blowy used to call these non-healing lesions, and I take great pleasure in teasing him about that, because I've shown him that you can get these right, as you well know. Their lesions denied the opportunity of recovery. They're not non-healing. They just need treating properly.
Trimming is something about removing. And if the problem is a lack of, I was thinking, what can we do? A part of putting something, block.
yes, high block.
High block and trimming out all of the underrun, isn't it? That's the key to it, yeah.
Soul hemorrhage in extensive. We have a lot of this kind of problem too.
Heifers?
And heifers, in cows, my heifers. But yes, because hard abrasive concrete, surface, hard surfaces, thin sole or difference or no imbalance between heels. And this is one example that we are finding in grazing cows. Something to do. And let's talk about intensive. You are expert in intensive. What kind of disease you find more in intensive systems?
White lines?
White lines.
Is one or so.
Soul ulcers.
Beautiful mountain.
Yes. Go to Colombia.
Yeah?
Soul hemorrhage, same problem in intensive system. Repetitive trauma, excessive standing.
Very much the same. I presume probably because, but I don't know for sure. The thin sole problem is more frequent even in extensive, no? Probably.
Yeah, more with the walking particularly.
Yeah, tracks
isn't it?
is important, but
Yeah.
it's more important here, more difficult to maintain at least.
Yeah.
In Almaray, they milk 4 times a day, but they have rubber mats all around. So
The cow's foot never sees concrete.
at the end, it's getting to a good adjustment between growth and wear. And then let genetics act. And of course, if the balance is not good genetically, those cows have to be addressed. Not because they get lame. Even In our experience in Almaray is that any cow can get lame, no matter she has a beautiful shape. But it's only very few farms that it happens that lameness is no more epidemic but episodic. When some epidemic thing becomes episodic, we must act the old way, just fix. When something is epidemic, we must act over risk factors, and one of these, if it's unbalanced, doing preventive trimming. The point is when this passes from one to the other, no matter it's pasture or not.
Yeah. I noticed you put excessive standing times there. That is a challenge for these grazing systems. We set 45, 50 minutes as our turnaround time in our housed herds. And then the grazing herds, they'll be in the collecting yard for 3 hours. And, then we wonder why we get the bruising.
Put money.
Yeah.
Rotary parlor.
Yes.
Guys, we have 2 more minutes.
2 minutes, wow.
Any final conclusions?
We are finishing. Toe ulcers or thin soles, same. Overwear, over trimming, moisture too, or sand. And the last one is digital dermatitis. That we have a huge problem with digital dermatitis.
You have?
No, you. In intensive, sorry.
Except if you have a good footpath program.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, prevention is the key.
Final conclusions. Adrian was saying things are changing very fast, but the two questions, are these different systems that different, or they're not as different anymore?
People working on extensive must learn from people working on intensive regarding the importance and the intensity of the food health and together the food trimming, and people from intensive must learn from extensive people the idea of optimizing the world and getting it focused to where reality is needed. And no problem about the bugs you are getting home back, but maybe must adapt working system to certain realities of certain farms. Majority, I think, is much more a lack of.
Well, let's give a hand to our speakers this morning, and let's switch gears.
Thank you, ANKA, for the invitation. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here with very special people. Only special people dedicate themselves full-time to mobility and hoof trimming. We had also the opportunity to have sun. I brought sun from Portugal, so an extra incentive or maybe some pressure for the contenders in the World Trimming Cup. So, today I want to share with you this reflection more than answer a question, and maybe you have the opportunity to discuss within ourselves our experiences. So this is the title of my presentation, Telomany in Extensive Cattle. I will not be talking about Holstein at all, okay? Meat herds that roam freely, to cut or not to cut. So, just a reminder, what is a teloma? Everyone has come across with this. It's an exaggerated development of the interdigital skin due to prolonged irritation and slow fibrosis of the skin between the toes and the subcutaneous tissues, okay? And it can occur in every limb. More frequently, it seems to be in the hind limbs, okay? And more frequently in very heavy bulls and big bulls. As we had the opportunity, me and my colleague Miguel Angel Garcia, back in 2020, when there was the first edition of this meeting, we asked trimmers from all the world how would they call this condition. So most common synonyms: hyperplasia interdigitalis, interdigital hyperplasia, fibroma, interdigital granuloma, corn, wart, calo, limax, which is the word that stands for snail in Latin, for its resemblance with a snail. And like in other conditions, the causes of teloma are multifactorial. We have to consider a mix of risk factors and trigger events and how they interact and which intensity they have and how everything snowballs. Okay? So I don't like to point, this is the main reason. For instance, some papers have come to light that genetics plays a very significant role. I have not that opinion. Okay? In my country, for instance, we more and more have this year that with 3 very mild winter months, 3 months of winter, and 9 months of summer, or prolonged drought, very traumatic conditions for the animal. Sometimes it can very quickly, the changing, so very rough floors, very aggressive vegetation that can cause trauma in the interdigital space, and then it snowballs, having the formation of these masses. So how I will answer this question, like Evgeny, and how my friends from Galicia say that it's the right answer, most of times. Depende, it depends. And maybe you can say a very sound yes when it's circumscribed, pear-shaped, slow-growing, smooth surface mass. You know for a fact that you will have at the final a very narrow implantated wound that it will close very easily. And probably a no when it's already diffuse, it's wide implantated, it's fast-growing, painful, infected, highly vasculated, coarse, bleeding mass. But a no with commas, because virtually you can operate every teloma. When I started this, there was a lot of worry about operating telomas. Don't be afraid to operate telomas, because the procedure is important, but more important is the aftercare, okay? The post-surgery care that you can give or not to those animals. And of course, you have to also consider the level of lameness, if there's alteration of gait or not. If the animal is walking soundly, why operate, okay? How many years is this animal being in the farm, okay? The age and value, the expectations of the owner, the time of the year. I only operate in winter, for instance, because in summer it's more difficult to have good conditions. It's very dry. Hydration of these tissues is also important. The hoof, I think, is very, how do you say, plastic tissue, okay? It's very plastic, and it can recuperate virtually everything. But also here it screams to us the same in other conditions. At PET, early detection, prompt, effective treatment. If you want to treat, you treat it as quick as you can, okay? So, how do we do it? I like to prepare. I have my anti-inflammatory drugs, my anesthesia, my disinfectants, these pincers that I will show you, a modified hoof knife that is the best tool to reach for this sometimes tight space, a clipper, and then also I will talk about a little bit about doing cauterization. There's a bit of, not controversy, but it depends. And then execute, okay? First you give the anti-inflammatory drug to start to act as soon as possible. So when you cut already, the animal has the effect of the anti-inflammatory and the analgesic drug. Of course, you have to trim, paying attention especially for the hard ridges, okay? For the excess tension and pressure in the zones that you should remove. Make a tourniquet. If you work with an ANKA, you already have a leg strap that constricts the extremity, but you can add some tourniquet to reduce bleeding. We pressure wash, very careful, the hoofs. We clip the hair, disinfect, and make a blockage, an infiltration. You can also make an IRA, an intravenous regional anesthesia, but sometimes it can be really hard because bulls have very thick skin, okay? And sometimes it can be very hard and you're losing time to cannulate, so you make an infiltration, and most of the times it works really, really well, okay? And then you wait 5-10 minutes, you're ready to cut, to do procedure, I use, this is a uterine clamp without rubber pads, and I use a hoof knife, very sharp, because it has this curvature, and it's really good to reach and to cut the tyloma where we have to, between the toes, okay? So, can you play the video from the left? 2 cases. Then you should do it as quickly and swiftly as possible. Sometimes we can do it only with 1 blow, and you get a very smooth surface. That it's important also to get a very quick and fast recovery of the wound, the results from the procedure. The video? No, it's 2 videos. The video doesn't work? Oh. Bueno, ya veremos si podemos mostrar. But it's very quick, okay? With the hoof knife, we can use the clamp, like I was saying, and it already naturally pushes the mass down, and you have the 2 hands free to do a very quick extirpation, okay? Well, okay. So as you see, I barely have no need to secure the teloma, okay? Because it's secure with the clamp. The other one, please. Okay, a question that I get a lot of times, to cauterize or not to cauterize. In principle, I'm not a very big fan of cauterizing because, yes, you stop bleeding, but you also burn cells that you need to granulate and to produce the closure of the wound. But, well, it works both ways, doing cauterization or just a compressive hemostatic bandage, okay? Examples. A young animal. Here it was mostly worry about an aesthetic question also. So no problem. We remove it, and this is the animal 2.5 almost months after, and it never had problem again, okay? This animal. So there's this temptation that always they recidivate. No, it's not true. Sometimes you get it the first time, and if you correct the environment, okay, and you get this animal for a regular trimming, it goes okay. Other situation, in this case, also you have to listen to the owner. He was not very prone, very, how do you say, very inclined to do the surgery. So you just do a trim, trying to take as much pressure on this zone, on the actual zone, model as much as you can to promote oxygenation and remove pressure from the mass, okay? More serious case, this bull also was someone that didn't know about trimming, about this possibility of do the surgery. Very good client, okay? Simply sometimes you arrive very late because people don't have any idea. So this very big mass already. The animal was a bit lame, okay? He liked a lot the animal. He wanted to keep it more 4 or 5 breeding seasons. So we did the procedure I described. In this case, I cauterized, big mass. Immediately, there's a big relief, as you can see. 10 days after removing the first bandage, I am very worried about controlling the possibility of infection, okay? Because if you give a good start to this to close, probably it will, okay? 33 days after, and the end result. So, Take-home messages. Discuss decision with clients, okay? The pros and cons, I think is very important. And then, okay, go for it. Articulate with vet. There's no reason why some of you are not vets. This procedure is not executed with anti-inflammatory, analgesia, and anesthetics, okay? Because you have to program for it, and you can articulate with your vet, okay? Prepare everything to do it as quick as possible and painless as possible. And inform client about follow-up and possible recidivism, okay? Most cases are, I would say 95% of cases are very good cases, very good prognosis, okay? Well, thanks you. Don't be afraid, operate telomas. When I started, I was a little bit skeptical because you hear a lot of stories, but this is a different game from Holstein cows, okay? In 15 years, I would say that I operate 5 cows. I don't operate cows. It's another issue, okay? It's an ongoing infectious of dermatitis, most cases. It's poor hygiene, it's humidity, and it's trauma, slippery floors, it's slated floors that traumatize the interdigital space, okay? In these conditions, if you have very good posture conditions after the removal of teloma, most of cases, everything will go smoothly, okay? Do it.
One of those that you showed there, you just did the trim, and it extends quite a bit further back. Do you do those too?
I didn't understand.
One of those pictures that you showed.
The one that I didn't cut.
Yeah,
Yes.
but the taloma extends quite up to the heel. Do you do those too?
Okay. Yes. I do. Yeah, but it was saying if I remove it all the way to the heel. Yes, yes.
How important is the aftercare after you remove the telomas? What's your advice to the farmers or to do to change or clean the wrap now and then?
Yeah.
Because I've done a lot with my local veterinarian too, and most of the time, it heals. It's a perfect procedure. Only the problem is the farmer now and then to change the wrap or do it in a foot bath with a wrap.
Thank you. Is pasture-based or confined animals? No. I'm asking if you're referring to animals that are pasture-based or housed inside a barn.
Inside, slatted stalls.
I don't operate those telomas. Listen, I have a very conservative approach to those telomas. Maybe you can use a paste to reduce the size of it. You can do bandages, but as you say, and you probably find, it will repeat itself because it's more an environmental changing issue. You have to correct, okay, foot bathing, correct slippery floors, correct trauma, correct infection between the toes.
As a complication of the surgery, does it happen sometime? They are so close of the interdigital clefts getting to septic joint?
I never saw that. The only one time that I have a very serious complication and it escalated really quickly and the animal was culled was like the ones that I show you on the right. And it's basically when it's very largely implanted and the client insists to cut, you can cut. But sometimes it's already too late. It's severely implanted, very, very deeply implanted, and you cannot achieve a closure of the wound. And yes, it can progress and go to the articular joints, and it complicates really quickly. So also the animal tells you what's the end result very quickly, okay?
¿Debemos de darle algún manejo especial al tiloma después de haberlo retirado?
Well, you see in the literature
Should we treat in a different way the tiloma when we have already treated? This was more or less the question.
Yeah, aftercare, you know, management. Yeah, I would say if you have the opportunity to limit the animal mobility a little bit, there's some literature that refers to put a wire to the toes, to join the toes. I never do that. I don't recommend it also. But yeah, you can limit a little bit the animal's movements, because of course, if you do it, you give the opportunity of the resulting wound close as soon as quickly as possible. Okay, that's if not that.
No,
oh, sorry.
The question is how.
But you referred like if it's contagious or something? No, I burn it, I throw it to the garbage, no problem. Yes, I remove it from the environment of the animal, yes, but I don't think it's how do you say, a biosecurity issue, a contagions issue. Yes, but you eliminate the tiloma. Don't throw it to the dogs. I don't think so. No. It's a mass that develops by repeated insult in the same place, okay? It's a calo, un callo, ¿no? ¿Es español? Bueno, si hay una permanente insulto a un sitio, la piel responde creciendo. No es contagioso. Yo no sé, pero no me parece.
My understanding, and I think it's a little bit what you say also, when there's in confined animals, dairy cows intensive, there is a big incidence of tiloma is because there is some contagious disease that is, and this is consequence of it, no? Dermatitis, it's dermatitis.
No, it's DD, definitely.
No, dermatitis and foot rot.
Yeah.
Foot rot.
Yeah.
Very much.
Yeah,
and
but
this just can be contagious,
before
no?
foot rot, you have probably an ongoing, non-resolved DD insult. Okay? So, for instance, we can say foot rot, no? Panaricio, phlegm. But the majority of phlegmons, well, some of them are traumatic, and there are other motives, for IFAs, for instance, but the phlegmons that I get are from repeated, non-resolved DD insults.
How long do you wrap the
10 days.
toes, and do you use some product for healing?
The product you prefer, it's okay.
But
okay?
soft products.
The more
sugar.
The most important. No, I use the products from Hoof. It's okay. It's not no problem. That discussion for me. No product is miraculous or is better than the other, okay? If it works, the most important in this procedure is really we take a lot of care to make it as disinfected and as clean as possible when you wrap it. Because you have to make sure that these wraps that I do stays 10 days. But you have to do it really in a clean environment, so after 10 days you have already a start, the tissue is already with some resistance and then it needs to be open and it really goes very well in but like I said, it's very important to have a very clean pasture and maybe a spray a few days. You can give a spray to the client and please check if it's okay, if it seems not swelling, if it seems recuperating, and put one time just to make the client involved, okay? And you put a spray, but it's not the most important.
Okay, so we have here the last question, okay? I see it's a very interesting theme.
Richard, thanks for the presentation. Luciano Marega, I think he said the name, when he do the operation and took off the tiloma, then he took the fat under the tiloma. Do you find any difference on take it off or not, that fat?
Well, it depends again on where it's implanted and the size of your cut. The ones you saw, it's not important. I don't go that deep, and it's enough. And I do an approach from behind. And when you cut the telomere from behind, generally you don't make as big of a hole in front aspect of the hoof. When you do it, or when you have the telomere more implanted there, yes, you get a hole and you get a lot of subcutaneous fat that you can remove some and cauterize. But I don't see it difficult to close also, okay? But it depends. I don't know if I answered, but if you cut it from behind and like this, in the interdigital space, it's a very thin wound to heal. If you go from the front with a scalpel, you open a big hole. That's when you get all that fat tissue that protrudes outside, okay?
One more. And in the bandage, have you ever tried sugar with some antibiotics?
No, I don't use antibiotics. I only use paste that it's antiseptic and it goes okay. Maybe I can do a second shot of anti-inflammatory NSAID drugs and no antibiotic.
So I kind of hinted at that yesterday. The question I want to answer is, like, does when we trim matter? And I realize there's a room full of hoof trimmers, right? So the answer to me is it depends. I'm going to tell you that some cows should be trimmed almost never, and some cows should be trimmed a lot more than we're trimming them, right? So I want to become a lot more strategic with what we're trimming, right? So we saw this yesterday, and I think I want to give credit to this, because when I started, so I met Adrian in Finland in 2007 or 8 at the International Lameness Conference. And I was like, oh, we got to trim cows. We got to do lots of trimming. And he's like, you're full of it. Wait till you get a little older, and you'll figure out that we don't need to trim as many cows. And I'm finally coming around to it, that we probably don't need to trim every cow twice or 3 times a year. We probably, some cows once, but I think it's due to Adrian saying, figure this out. Push, like he kept pushing me to say, we don't need to trim as much. We don't need to trim as much. And I think I'm on board with that now. Some large farms I work with, we're actually doing studies where we're trimming some cows once in lactation, but more other cows just when they need it. So let's figure that out. This is because of large farms, right? So I used to work in Canada, 50 cow farms, 100 cow farms, 200 cow farms. It's much harder to implement strategic trimming on those farms, right? Because you have to charge a lot more to make it work. But on these large farms, we're walking a lot, there's a lot of wear. So what's the role of trimming when there's a lot of wear, right? Trimming just removes the excess of growth. And if there's balance between wear and growth, what does a trimmer really need to do? So this is kind of my bias, what I'm working with, right? Let's look a little bit about what are some of the bottlenecks on dairies, because that's how I like to think about it. It's like, so if the dairy is going to be efficient with lameness, what is the thing that's making them not efficient with lameness? Some data and behavior on trimming, and then talking about the concepts. So what I want you to think about is, this is easier on this side. So there we go. Right, so I have a bunch of healthy cows on this side here, right? So these are healthy cows. I want to get 4 healthy cows over here. But in the system, there's some bad things that are happening, right? It could be bad trimming, for example. Like, nobody would agree that this is good trimming. It could be a dirty environment. It could be a bad foot bath. If I come onto this farm as a consultant and say, I have to fix the trimming on this system, am I going to have more healthy cows? This is the one with the biggest impact. If I fix this, so if I come in and says, okay, I fixed the trimmers, I'm still going to have only 1 healthy cow because I fixed the wrong thing, right? So when we walk on farms, we have to say, what's the biggest thing that's impacting lameness? Yes, it's going to help if we fix this, but because this is the biggest thing, that's the one we have to fix first. If we fix this one first, then we can fix this, and then we can fix trimming, right? So your job as a consultant is to say, what's the biggest thing we need to fix on the farm? So I want to ask you, what's the biggest thing that's wrong with your clients' farms? Prevention. Okay, that's what there are trimmers in the room, right? So prevention, we need to trim more. What else? Hygiene. Okay. Anything else? What's that? What they eat, what they standing times. Oh, I was going to say, you're all wrong till Adrian said it. The biggest problem is lack of detection. And I'll show you why. Okay, right? So I would argue the biggest thing, we can go to any dairy tomorrow and reduce lameness by finding more lame cows. It doesn't make sense, but it makes sense when we go through it. And there's actually some math we can do with it. Okay? I'm back in Canada. I have an 8-cow farm. Right? So on this farm, it's a block calving herd. Right? So we're all going to calve them on day 0. Nick's going to come and assess the dairy at 120 days in milk. And he's going to count how many lame cows we have. The blue spots, and every single cow gets lame. So we have 100% incidence of lameness on this dairy. And they get lame at the start of this blue box, and they end being lame at the end of this blue box. Right? So on the day that Nick is there, 1 cow's lame, 2 cows lame, 3 cows is lame, 4 cows is lame. So his lameness prevalence is 50%. Okay. So this farm listened to Adrian and said, I'm going to find more lame cows. So this is what happens when we find cows, right? So now we have gray boxes. The dark gray is how short the time is lame. So we find the cow, we treat her right away. On these cows, the blue, she's lame for a much longer time period, right? So here we get way better at finding lame cows with either people or technology. And now she's only lame for the dark gray, and the light gray is what she's no longer lame in, right? So if we go and count all these cows, Nick's here scoring these cows, this cow's no longer lame. This cow's no longer lame. This cow's no longer lame. Only this cow is lame because we've reduced the duration of disease. Instead of being lame for 100 days, this cow's only lame for 28 days, right? So we haven't changed prevention at all. There's still 8 cows that are getting lame, but because I've reduced the duration of disease, I have less lame cows on my farm. I've changed nothing else. I've just changed the duration of disease. That's why detection works, because we reduce the duration of disease. That's why I think it's the most important thing we can do. Okay, so how do we do this, right? Let's talk a little bit about that, and then we'll get into how this is a component. Because detection is the most important, and once we have detection figured out, we can get a lot more strategic with some of the other things, right? I think we underestimate using parlor detection, right? In some of these large systems, paying somebody to stand there for 8 hours and watch all the cows to give them a mobility score, I can't convince my U.S. farmers to do that. But I convince them to walk down a parlor, stand at the rotary, and look at 1 pen every day, right? So if there's 8 pens, there's 1,000 cow in 8 pen, for example. We look at all those cows, we sort the cows out, we trim them, and we're done with them, right? We can do that in the parlor. We can pick out some of these signs and bring these cows to the chute. We can look at cows that have blocks that aren't working. This one's obviously lame. But there's a system, right? So the thing is we need to create a system, right? Or we can look and become more strategic, right? So we do a mobility score, but I don't care if she's a 0, a 1, 2, or 3. I just want to know if she's lame or not, okay? Treat the severe immediately. Miles, if we're going to give him a score, sometimes we don't want too many false positives because then the trimmer gets mad and says, okay, there's too many cows without problems. Or we can look at technologies, right? So there's a lot of camera systems. So Cada is one of the sponsors. I think there's opportunities for callers. But, right, we have to think about all this thing together, right? The vision of most of these companies is technology, we identify the cow, we see some behavior, and we give an action. I think with all these technologies, we need to consider some of the cow level factors, right? If this cow has a history of lesions, I probably don't need a technology to say she's going to be lame. I know she's going to become lame. So I can become more strategic. What I'm interested in is finding cows that have never been lame and finding those cows, right? And for that, we probably need some cow data to go with it. And just some example of some of the data we have on camera technology. This is some data from the Cada technology I've been working with. So this is first lactation, second lactation, 3 and 4. This is days before trimming. So we trimmed the cow here, and then we looked at the scores up to 4 weeks before, right? So this is just the healthy cows. So when we looked at the data, they said these cows had no problems. And this is the score. So the technology scores from 0 to 100. And these middle lines here tell you what the average score was or the median score was at that point in time. And then these bars and boxes kind of show you the variation. So we have cows ranging from about 10 to all the way up to 75 or 80 with a healthy trim, with no lesions. Okay, so that's the healthy cows. Then if we look at cows with a lesion, so that's the yellow, we can see pretty easily that these scores are a little higher, right? 39 and 48 in second lactation, 44 and 52. So two things we see. First lactation cows have lower scores. As the cow gets older, she gets higher scores. Lesion scores are a little higher, but also what we see, there's a lot of overlap, right? So if I look at a cow with one score, I don't know if she's lame or not lame based on the score. Because a cow with a score of 50, for example, right here, so the week before trimming, she's got a score of 50. She could be lame or she could be healthy, right? So there's a lot of things we need to think about and make the system work together. And this is one example of a technology, but most technologies suffer from the same problem. There's a lot of false positives, so we have to take some fine-tuning with the system. We can make that work. We're working on some other ways to look at some data to make it work. But as the technologies exist right now, I would argue there's still too many false positives, right? Because the question is, if I send 10 cows to the chute with the technology because they're lame, how many need to be lame for you to think the technology is worthwhile? 10, 5, 2. Like if I send 2 cows are really lame, people are going to say that's not enough, right? If I send 5, I would argue that's getting pretty close. If I'm 50% and we're finding these cows, that might be enough, right? Is it 10 out of 10? I don't think 10 out of 10 because people aren't 10 out of 10. If I pick lame cows and they're 10 out of 10, I'm not finding enough lame cows, right? Because then I'm only finding the severely lame cows. So this is one thing to consider. Okay, data and behavior. Let's look at some data, right? So we talked about the hoof trimming goals. Treat lameness and prevent lameness. Sure, we all think prevention is what we want to do. I'm trying to argue, if we look at some of the data, only 2 studies really looked at the timing of trimming, right? So if we say, when should we trim cows? Only 2 studies looked at it. One of them was do it in the winter versus like twice a year in spring and fall, and one was done in the US, right? So that's not a lot of studies, not a lot of difference. One was pasture-based, one was kind of dry lot-based, so not really applicable to our current situations. So what do we do with that? Like, I'm a big believer that we make decisions based on data. So I would argue the research data, when it comes to timing of trimming, is pretty useless. So what do you do then, right? So there is some data, right? So we all like to trim feet. We all like to run a cow through the chute. But what's the cost to the cow when we run a cow through the chute? Right? If you think about it, we take a cow, she's happy. Cows like to eat, lay down, and make milk. How much of that is she doing when she's waiting for the chute, to go into the chute? She's not eating, she's not laying down, which is when she makes milk, and she's not in the parlor, right? So we're likely, there's a probability that she loses milk. So we looked at several farms, we looked at 4 different farms, and what we did is, right, so this is lying time. 0 is what the lying time was in the week before trimming. And then how does lying time change after trimming, right? So this is the day after trimming. So 0 is when the trimming was, and days after trimming. So what happens is, on the day of trimming, lying time goes down, which makes sense because she's being trimmed. Then the week after, on this farm, lying time goes up about 40 minutes, and then it slowly comes back down. On farm 2, it doesn't really change. On farm 3, it goes down 50 minutes, so an hour or less, and then it goes up, sometimes an hour or more, and then kind of goes back down. Right? That pattern holds on different farms. So when we think about it, when we take a cow out of her natural environments to trim her, there's a change in her behavior. And then the next time, she acts like she's a lame cow, because lame cows lay down more sometimes, right? Let's look at that. That's lying time. What about milk production? right? So if I look at milk production, 0 once again is what she was the week before, and then after trimming, on almost every single farm, we lose milk production, right? Sometimes up to 2 kilograms of milk after trimming. Is that a good thing? Business is selling milk, right? So this got me thinking, say maybe Adrian's onto something, right? If we're going to trim a cow, there needs to be a benefit, right? Because we're losing something, we're doing something harmful to the cow, we're changing our behavior, and we're losing some milk production when we're trying to sell milk, right? So there needs to be a benefit. And what's the benefit? Okay, other thing to consider, how much of an impact does trimming really have? Right, so we talk about lameness is an issue on dairy farms, but I think we need to think about it a little more precise, right? If I look at lameness, I like to look at first cases and all the other cases. So if I look at first cases, that means if she had a slow ulcer or a white line, was it her first case ever? Or was it her second, third, or fourth more chronic cases, right? So if I look at first lactation, this represents data from about 200,000 cows. All the dairies that I do some consulting with, we have all the data in one database. We kind of look at them. Most of it's driven by a large system that I work with, but includes some other farms. So if I look at first cases and overall, I have very low, like 1%. Can I get that much lower by trimming? I don't know. White line, 4% on average, right? But if I look at repeat cases, I'm at 15%, 11%, 7%, 5%. So if we separate out all the cases versus first cases are relatively low, but all the other cases put together, they're much higher. So when we think we have a lot of lame cows, I would argue we have a lot of chronic cows. We don't create a lot of new cases, but we create a lot of chronic cows. Right? And we need to address that. And if we split that out by first and second lactation, so in first lactation, very few cases, right? And it makes sense, there's not a lot of chronic cases. Kind of Adrian was talking about that in the extensive pasture discussion, right? As cows get older, this is example in first lactation, or fourth lactation, right? 1%, 2% for first cases. So this cow survives the fourth lactation, then she got a lameness case, so she would go in here. But here, we're up to 32% of cases over 100 cows over the whole dairy, right? So that's 30% of cases we're seeing, but really only 8 of those are new cases. So the problem is chronic cases. If we can deal with our chronic cases, we're going to solve lameness on dairies. How do we deal with chronic cases? Find them earlier and treat them most appropriately, is my argument. Okay. So then one argument. So I worked with a dairy system, and I talked to them, and they're like, maybe we should stop trimming cows, right? So I used to be like big prevention. They're like, do we really need to trim? So they did do mid-lactation trim. So I think they believe we need to do a pre-dry off trim. I think everybody can agree we probably need to do that. But the argument is, when should we trim cows a second time if we need them? So what they did is they took first lactation animals, which had very low lameness already, and they said, we're going to stop trimming mid-lactation. So they roughly trimmed at 100 days in milk, 110 days in milk. And they said, we're going to stop it. So this is a very large study. So they trimmed first lactation animals. About 4,000 or 3,500 they trimmed, and about 4,500 they didn't trim. Okay? And then we looked at them, okay, what happened the next time they trimmed them? So typically that was a dry-off trim. Then we said, how many lesions did they have at that next trim? Right? So if we look at any lesion, right, 172 lesions out of 4,000 cows and 104. So about a 1% difference in any lesion over 100. So that means if I trim 100 cows and I spend, let's say, 15 euros for a trim, that means I spend $1,500 to prevent one case of lameness. And most times, I think nobody in this room would say, is one case of lameness worth $1,500? Because I spend 100 cows, I run them through the trim chutes, I've also lost some milk. Right? So I've lost some milk to send those 100 cows through the chute, and I've only prevented one case of lameness. So lameness, trimming works, it prevents lameness, but just a little bit. Okay? We can split it up by lesions. A little bit of it is infectious lesions. Some of it, most of it's driven by non-infectious lesions, which makes sense, mainly white lines. But if we look at time to next trim, because you could argue, okay, yes, we prevent lameness, but if we don't trim them, they're going to go lame much faster. Really not much difference. There's a 1-day difference on time to lameness between the groups. So that really doesn't matter. And we can look at that here. This is a survival curve saying how long after trimming or when she was enrolled did this cow go lame. So we have a red bar and a blue bar. Blue is we trimmed them. Red is we didn't trim them. And as you can see, when the bars are very close together or they overlap, it means that there's no difference between the groups. So not trimming these cows in first lactation didn't harm them. I would argue it probably helped them because we didn't disrupt them. Okay? We're repeating this study in second and third lactation cows, and so far it looks like it's the same result. Okay? This is the numbers. Because there's so many cows, you can get the statistical significance, but then it becomes, does it really pay to make this happen? So I would argue it doesn't pay. Okay, what do we do with that? Right? I like trimmers. I like trimming cows' feet. How do we make this work on dairies? Right? I want you to think about the groups that exist on dairies. I would argue there's 4 groups on dairies. There's healthy cows, there's newly lame cows, there's the recheck cows, and there's the chronic cows. And I would argue we need to design trimming programs for each of these cows, right? Instead of saying every cow gets trimmed twice a year, 3 times a year, we design a program that says you get trimmed this many times, you get trimmed this many times, and you might get trimmed 4 times a year. And we can do that with the data that exists. So let's talk about the healthy cows. The healthy cows are the cows you don't know. Right? As a trimmer, you see them, you look at them like, there's really not much to take off. I can put the foot down. Okay, so what do we do with those? Right? So when I create a trim list, I might say, okay, she's a dry-off trim, or she's been like 400 days since she was last trimmed. We probably should look at her at that point. Right? So for those cows, I would recommend you adjust the wear. Right? So if we have, for example, the farm we're at right here, maybe there's not as much wear, so maybe we need to trim them a little bit more frequently. Maybe on a sand-bedded freestyle or walking long distances, we maybe don't need to trim them. We just find lame cows, right? It depends on this wear. Okay, use the data. So if you can see, okay, we're seeing a lot of lameness after 400 days, let's trim them then. I would argue as a safe way, we probably still do a dry-off trim, right? Let's a dry-off inspection. We're already handling those cows. We want them to produce less milk. So if we run them through the chute and we change behavior, lose milk production, it's not as big a deal because we want that to happen. Yearly, so I've run into some troubles where I've implemented this. You forget about the cows that are do not breeds. So cows that are not pregnant and they stay around and they end up being 600-700 days in milk and they haven't been trimmed and they end up with really long feet. So probably yearly is what we need to do for those healthy cows. If they don't have a history of lameness, that means you've never been in the chute for a lameness, ever. Just trim them once a year and we'll should be fine. Okay, newly lame cows. Right, what do we do for those? We need to identify them, right? We need to have a system. We talked about this already. We treat them immediately and appropriately. Now, what does that look like? Right? This is where we need to think about. This is one diagram that kind of illustrates how we get to this cow with a sole ulcer. But basically the key point of this is basically driven by inflammation. What Adrian's calling laminitis or chronic laminitis, right? It's probably chronic inflammation, right? That's what's happening on these cows. So what do we do with that, right? Because this leads to the chronic cows. Because what happens with that chronic inflammation, it changes the bone inside the hoof capsule. When that change happens, we create these bony spurs. So this is some work coming out of the UK, right? So this is a healthy foot over here. This is a cow with a history of lameness. And what happens on these feet is they have a lot of bony changes. And that's what's making these cows sore and kind of repeat. So when we walk on this basically bone spur, it's like you walking with a rock in your shoe, right? It gets painful, puts pressure on it, and creates this kind of repeat mechanism to create lameness. Okay, what can we do to control this? So there's some recent work coming out. But it would make sense. If the problem is inflammation, what can we do when we find these lame cows? We can give them anti-inflammatories, right? So what does that story look like? Some really great work done out of the UK looking at first lactation animals, where we give it at calving and at lameness, and then we locomotion scored them for 34 months, right? So James Wilson and part of Nick's group did this, I would argue, a pretty amazing study, looked at cows for a long time period, but they had 3 different treatment groups, and let's look at those a little closer. And then they looked at what's the risk of that cow becoming lame after she was enrolled, right? So there's 4 different treatment groups, but the bottom line is if you give them an NSAIDs at calving and at trimming, or I would argue, James kind of downplayed this, but I think if we give them an NSAIDs at trim only, you both reduce the risk of future lameness by doing that, right? So that's a benefit. So I would argue if I have a lame cow in my chute and I know it's their first case, I'm going to give them a dose of NSAIDs or course of NSAIDs right at that time because I know we can change likely what happens to that bone at that point in time. Okay? Which is an interesting thing, so this is a survival curve again, so how long after enrollment or with first calving do these cows get called? In both groups that got the NSAIDs, we improve the survival, right? So the cows last longer if we give them NSAIDs, either at calving and at lameness or at lameness, right? We can argue which one's significant, but I would argue both works. And I think from an implementation aspect, it's much easier to say when she's lame, we're going to give her non-steroidal instead of giving everybody non-steroidal as a calving. Because that's, from a public perception perspective, I think becomes something to consider. But giving a cow at lameness, for first lameness, that's something to consider. Okay. The other thing they did is they looked at cows that hadn't calved yet. The story there is a little different, right? So when they enrolled those cows, basically, there's no difference in groups. So whether she got NSAIDs or was trimmed alone or only got NSAIDs at lameness, it didn't matter what we did. There was no impact other than we need to trim them and put them through the chute, right? If we just give them the NSAIDs at lameness and don't trim them, then there's a much higher risk of future lameness. So we need to do something in the chute for those cows. So these are the older cows, right? So this is the chronic. They've already had chronic changes, either through calving, either through lameness. So there's no impact to survival with to do that. So the story for me is, if I have a cow that has likely no history of lameness, I'm going to give her NSAIDs. For an older cow that's lame, I'm going to run her through the chute. And we could argue, I don't think the NSAIDs do much for those cows. Okay, that's that group, right? So we have the healthy cows. We're going to trim those maybe once a year. Newly lame cows, we're going to find them, have a system to find it, whether it be technology or people, it doesn't matter. Then we have these recheck cows. And I think what I want to get at for these cows is we need to have a system, right? So when I have my cows, the recording software we use, this is a graph out of Dairy Comp, but when we enter a cow with an ulcer or a white line or a thin sole or a block, she automatically gets put on the recheck list. So 4 weeks later, we look at her again, right? What we're trying to do there is to make sure the cow's healing. We're trying to create a system, just like you, when you go to the doctor and you get a cast put on, or they say, come back in 6 weeks to make sure everything's healing. That's the system we're trying to create, right? What we're trying to do is, this is an example, right? So this was 3 weeks after. This is what the lesion looked like before we cleaned it up. We're just trying to speed up the healing, right? If we clean up this loose horn, this is going to heal faster than if we let this cow suffer. My philosophy is, once the cow's lame, she's going to come back into the chute. You can either choose the time she comes back in, or she's going to choose for you. And when she chooses, it's probably a bad decision for her and a bad decision for the farm, because it's much later than you would want her to bring it back in. So I want to choose the time and say, I'm going to force you into my chute to make sure we're healing. Okay, what we're looking for, 4 to 6 weeks, depending on your trim schedule. Look for healing and blocks position, right? So for example, this cow was back in the chute, the block was rotated, put a different block on, hopefully speed up her healing. So instead of waiting 90 days to bring her back in the chute, at 30 days, we say, okay, you're not healing properly, let's fix her in that way. Okay, and then the chronic cows. So these are the cows with a history of lameness, especially sole ulcers and white lines. I would argue if she's had a history of lameness, she's no longer in the healthy group. She becomes a cow that we see in the chute probably at least twice, maybe even 3 times a year, because she's already shown us in our system, you are a problem cow, and we need to address you, right? So I would trim those cows 3 to 4 times a month, or every 3 to 4 months, because there's already these bony changes. We're just trying to manage this cow, right? We're trying to do, we know you're a problem, we know you're going to be an issue. Let's do preventative repeat cases, right? We're not trying to prevent new cases. We're trying to prevent the reoccurrence of that case. She's going to have different horn growth because of that pressure she's got on her foot. Okay. So what's her take home, right? Does when we hoof trim matter? I think it depends. It depends on the cow she is. For chronic cows, probably it does. For our healthy cows, I'm not convinced there's a huge economic benefit to the cows, right? So bottom line, I want trimmers on farms a lot of times, but I want them to trim the right cows, right? I don't want them to trim every single cow. Very often, right? So people mistake my message for, you don't want trimmers on farms. Like, no, I want trimmers on farms. I want them to touch a lot of cows, but I want them to touch the right cow. With that, I'm happy to take questions. Hold on for the microphone, David.
I have a farm that I trim mid-lactation, and he quit trimming the first lactating animals. And I noticed by the time they hit the dry period, they had some pretty bad feet.
Right.
Which I could have corrected that at mid-lactation because we don't do pre-calving heifers.
Right. So, and I think like this becomes farm specific, right? So, and I think there's 2 things we need to consider. And I have this argument with trimmers, right? So we see, like when you say pretty bad feet, do you see there's lesions or they're just long and ugly? Right. So long and ugly. So there's some courtship, right? So to me, the courtship is becoming the chronic cow list, right? It's identifying those cows early, right? So to me, this works if we have a system to find the lame and the ugly cows in mid-lactation, right? If we don't have that system, it becomes much harder to implement, right? So depends on the dairy. Some dairy thinks it's much easier to manage a list, right? They say, okay, I have 1,000 cows, and I know in my mid-lactation trim, every week I trim 50 of those cows because they're mid-lactation. And I don't have to worry about looking for lame cows, right? So you become the lame cow detector, the ugly feet controller. That's easy for some systems. But other systems say, okay, that costs me money, so how do I make it work, right? It's finding the balance between the systems. So on your farm, maybe like the mid-lactation on first lactations would be a benefit because we prevent those ugly feet. I would argue you're probably, like when you say, yes, you see more, is it 10%? It's not all the first lactation cows that weren't trimmed, right? It's only a percentage of those cows, right? So to me, I would focus my energy on dealing with that percentage of cows instead of trimming all the cows, right? But you need to have a system in place to make that happen, right? So what can the farm handle? Some farms can handle that. Some farms, it's much easier to say, just create the list and trim everybody, and we'll deal with it that way.
Jared, speaking about NSAIDs, is there any research that can point you to a specific product, a specific active principle in detriment of others, or?
Sorry, I missed the first part of the question.
Do you find a specific active principle better than others on NSAIDs?
Oh, NSAIDs, yes. So the NSAIDs that was used in the UK study was ketoprofen. Okay. In theory, ketoprofen or meloxicam would work. The benefit of ketoprofen is there's no milk withhold, right? So all the other products typically have a milk withhold. So
as carprofen, right?
Yeah, so, and I'll have to admit, so in carprofen, what's the milk withhold on carprofen?
0.
0, okay. So in my world, because I live in a backwards country, we don't have access to NSAIDs, right? So where you are in your world, or when I worked in Canada, we had access to ketoprofen. So I would use a product with an NSAIDs that have a 0 milk withhold. That would be my criteria.
Good day, everyone. I'm going to say good day because in 2 weeks I fly off to Australia to take up a new life down under. So it's a huge pleasure, an honor to be here. Very grateful to Daniel, Adrian, and the ANKA team for this invite. I've heard so much about the ANKA Summer Trimming School. I've known so many people who have come here, and now I understand why people talk so highly about it. So thank you again to all the organizers for the invitation. My job has largely been done. Thank you to Gerard and Adrian and everyone else for the real plug to talk about this subject. I got passionate about this when I was doing my PhD. So I'm a vet by background, by training. I grew up on a farm. I grew up on a sheep and beef farm. So I spent some time learning how to trim feet. And so I was always quite interested in this subject. I got an opportunity once I was 3 years graduated to do a project on cows' feet, because I thought, gosh, this is a big topic, really important, very interesting. And so 25 years ago, my passion in cows' feet started. Around the same time, Gerard was doing his PhD, and Xenia was doing his PhD. I can't see Xenia. There, yeah. So we've all sort of been doing our PhDs around the same time. And my PhD topic involved implementing lameness control programs on dairy farms. And back then, it was the most spectacular failure. And it was quite frustrating because I thought we had all the information. We just needed to implement it. And so we provided dairy farmers with all this information, lots of technical detail on how to prevent lameness. And because we just bombarded our dairy farmers with information, they switched off. And what I realized is we needed to take a much more, a different approach. So we went back to the drawing board, and off that experience, we came up with some ideas how to motivate and inspire dairy farmers to make change. But one of the key findings from my original research was that actually the early detection, prompt effective treatment, I'm going to use that phrase, someone mentioned it earlier, EDPET is how we abbreviate it. If we can do early detection, prompt effective treatment, then that is the thing that will make the biggest improvement for a lot of farms that are starting out on that lameness improvement journey. So just a little bit of a background. I've had an academic background. I worked at the University of Bristol for many years. We were very fortunate. We had some fantastic funding for quite a number of years. Then I moved to the Royal Veterinary College, and then more latterly I've been working through the University of Nottingham, and we've continued to have some pretty good funding over the recent years for lots of different research projects, mostly focused on the early detection, prompt effective treatment. But I'm also fortunate that I go on holiday pretty much every day of the year because I get to travel the world and see some quite amazing farms, and they can be fully housed herds in the UK, grazing herds mostly in the UK, but I also see a variety of systems around the world, including some dry lots and some. The only system I don't see much of are the tie stalls, so I'm seeing most of the different systems represented around the world. And I think we all know we're dealing with a prey animal, and the cow is very good at hiding the signs of pain, which for me is the basic explanation for why when we often spot a cow as lame, she's quite a way progressed through the lesion process. And so if we can come up with ways in which we can spot the lame cow before she goes lame, then we have an advantage. And I think we can be better than the lion at spotting the lame cow. I think as human beings, we have the ability to be very sensitive to changes in the way that cows walk. Some people are better than others. It's fair to say. There are some people that can spot the subtle signs far more quickly than others. But with training and practice and repeated reinforcement, then we can get better. And I think the process of spotting lameness before cows go lame is something we can train people to do. And this is a theme I want to come back to, because how often do we train the farm staff on our farms to spot lame cows? Hands up, how many of you have done training with farm staff on how to spot lame cows? Okay, I saw a handful of, a few hands go up. Yeah, I think this is a massive opportunity and brings benefits to you as trimmers, because if you are dealing with problems at a much earlier stage, they are much easier to fix. So you get more reward, you are having to put on fewer blocks, because sometimes the problem can be dealt with. If it's caught early enough, it may be that you can catch it before you have to do too much blocking and other treatments at all. So I'm going to put to you that many of the lesions we see are, the most common lesions causing lameness are actually end stage. And I credit my colleague John Huxley, who moved to New Zealand a few years ago, for sort of pointing this out. If we had a sole ulcer, we'd be pretty sore, and we'd be pretty upset if the doctor wasn't treating it as an emergency. So, the worst thing that we probably get is a sort of ingrown toenail or a corn on our foot, or, that's what this is, a little bit of a corn, and it's a bit uncomfortable, isn't it? But imagine, we were dealing with 15% of us with this, and this is a trimmer colleague of mine who took the end of his thumb off with the grinder. And you can imagine that, sorry, I should have warned you. No one's squeamish in the room. Sometimes I have to warn audiences. But, I think that hurt. It put him out of action for a few days. And so you can see the swelling going up his thumb. So, we maybe need to think, actually, if we've got a sole ulcer, it's more like this, isn't it? And so if we all were walking around with thumbs like this, we'd be upset and doing something about it. The other reason why I think we're dealing with end-stage disease, it's not just because it's severity, but it's because we've now got quite a lot of data. Gerard mentioned the work that Ruben Newsom was doing on the bone spurs and cows with lameness history. We see this formation of bone spurs, and it's no wonder these cows don't walk right, and it's no wonder when a cow has gone lame, she is then inclined to be lame again in the future. So Laura Randall came 2 years ago. She would have mentioned the biggest risk factor for lameness is actually previous lameness. And we know lameness history is a very good predictor of future lameness. But also James Wilson's work showing that actually when you have lameness and inflammation, you then get scarring. And that scarring, so this is some CT scans of the fat pads, and what you see is where there's lameness history, there is scarring and reduction of the fat pads, and that's another explanation as to why, once a cow has gone lame, experienced that inflammation, she loses this protective fatty tissue underneath the pedal bone. So this is the flexor tuberosity in here, and the fat pads surround this flexor tuberosity and protect it, and if we've lost it with inflammation and scarring, then her chances of having good mobility in the future are diminished. So that's a little bit of an introduction to why I think this is such an important subject. And what if every farm had a crystal ball and we could predict the cows that were likely to have lesions? And Gerard sort of pointed out that we do that by running every cow through the crush twice a year, 3 times a year, maybe sometimes even 4 times a year, to try and work out which cows are likely to have lameness and try and do a preventative trim. But actually, if there might be a better way to do this. And one way is obviously with watching for the earliest signs of lameness. So I'm going to talk about what do we mean by lameness, and actually are we limited by our current understanding of what a lame cow is? I'm going to reiterate the point that Gerard made, that actually for a lot of farms, the lameness treatments are dominated by lame cows and end-stage lesions. And actually, if we refocus on early lesions and new lame events, then we actually have a better return on the investment of our time and effort. I'm going to talk a little bit about what are the predictive behaviors for early stage lesions and really explain what do I mean by this concept of EDPET, early detection, prompt effective treatment. And then I'm just going to remind you that I am a believer in prevention and actually how all of this can feed into preventative strategies. So I'm going to show you 2 video clips to try and bring the cows to you. Now, the cow on the left, she does slip a little bit in this video clip, but I want you to look carefully and decide, you know, which of these cows has worst mobility. And, you know, I like a little bit of audience participation. And I think this is a relatively straightforward question, but I want to then ask you a further clarification on that question. So, show of hands. Who thinks the cow on the left has the worst mobility? Can I see your hands, please? Okay, that's quite a few. How many of you think the cow on the right has worse mobility? Okay, a few more hands. Okay, yeah. So there's a little bit of debate there. So let me rephrase this question. So, how many of you think the cow on the left would meet the definition of a lame cow? Okay, fewer hands. How many? Maybe I need to leave longer for the translation. How many of you on the right would think she would make a definition of a lame cow? Okay, a few hands, not many. Okay. Now, how many of you, maybe I'm saying this too quickly, how many of you would think these cows are likely to benefit from a treatment? Can I see your hands? Okay, not all of you. Okay, so but quite a few, I think a few more. So a few late hands there. So I think it's quite. So what my approach to this, I think both of these cows are likely to benefit from treatment. The cow on the right, she was uneven weight bearing. She was putting less weight in the back right. She was a younger cow. For me, she is the one we want to be absolutely getting in the crush straight away. The cow on the left is likely to have more long-term problems, but is also likely to benefit from a treatment. Maybe not the same level of urgency on the one on the right, but by watching for these behaviors, we can start to prioritize cows in different ways. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that prioritization. So this concept of early detection, prompt effective treatment. So early detection, in all our research, we would find that if you've got a means of screening cows on a regular basis, there is potential to find some of these cows 60 days prior to them going lame. That's some data we published over 15 years ago now, where we followed cows in a number of herds in the UK. They were well-managed herds, and we were implementing a screening, a mobility scoring every 2 weeks, and following half of the herds we just followed, and half of the herd we got into the crush, and we would treat them when we saw the early signs of lameness. And we found we could spot the signs of lameness in our control group 60 days before the farmer responded to them, on average, as a median. So the early detection, I think we can do in a number of ways. There are plenty of farms where just very good observation by the farm team will achieve the same sort of thing. But if we have a formula for searching for lame cows, then that will help spot those early signs. Prompt treatment, we should treat the lame cow or the early lame cow as an emergency. And the reason for that is, there's no point scoring a cow or spotting a cow today if you're not getting her into the trim chute within a day or two. We need to be responding quickly. How many of you have worked with farms where you're coming in once a month and they're saving all their lame cows for you on a once-a-month basis? There is then a month's opportunity loss for catching some of those lame cows. So we ought to treat these early lame cows as an emergency, because we know that inflammation is resulting in scarring and formation of bone spurs. And then there's lots that we can talk about effective treatment. And I think we are still learning about what makes effective treatment. There are still lots of debates going on. But I think if we've got a means of assessing how effective our treatments are we achieving a reasonable recovery rate, so an apparent cure rate of over 90% by 4 to 6 weeks after treatment would be what I would be looking for. And if we've got a way of reassessing cows by some form of scoring, then we can start to reevaluate that. But we can also look at rechecks. So there was a mention earlier about, Gerard mentioned about rechecks. I think there's huge value in the recheck in assessing whether our treatments are being as effective as we think they should be. Okay, so my philosophy it sort of stems a little bit from research and a little bit from teaching in vet schools. And I have, while I was at the RVC, we had this mantra that assessment drives learning. And I'm a passionate believer in that. I like to generate data, look at data, and try and coach teams to find the next bit of improvement. We are in an industry where there is no room for guesswork any longer. And I think we need to be finding those fine gains, those fine margins, to help our industry get the next level of gain. And and that assessment applies at all levels. It applies to the on-farm trimming teams. It applies to how good we are at finding lame cows, and it's also applied to how well we're performing with the cows that are presented in the foot crush. And as trimmers, you're always limited. You always have to rely on the right cows being presented to you at the right time, and that's a really important point. So one of the metrics that I really like to generate is a mobility score. Now, you could say lame or not lame, and you can debate about whether the term lameness is the right term, because as you can see, everyone has a different opinion as to what a lame cow is. But at least if we use a scoring system, we can get round the concept of what is a lame cow, as long as we can get some standardization on how we perceive scores. So this is some data from a farm that we were working with back in March 2007. And we did a whole herd score, and we identified 70% of cows likely to benefit from treatment. So those 2 video clips, they would have constituted a cow likely to benefit from treatment, so they would have been within that 70%. It was a shocking figure to me. That was the worst herd that I'd dealt with at that point in time. And I thought, gosh, there's no hope for this farm. They need to go out of business. That's too much of a problem. But we had the opportunity to work with this farm and implement this concept of EdPET, early detection, prompt effective treatment. So we thought, well, how often should we be screening this herd? So we implemented a weekly, once a week, scoring of the herd as the cows came out of the parlor. Now, for me, it gives you the most accurate and best opportunity for assessing cows carefully in the way that they walk to identify those early lameness behaviors. But as Gerard said, it's an investment of time. On this herd, it had a 2-hour milking. So we had, at that time, £10 an hour was what we were paying the scorer. So that was £20 investment. But for me, that was a good investment in a scorer, because the return on that investment's vast for this type of herd. So initially, we saw some improvement, largely brought about because straight away we could see there was some digital dermatitis. We could see that when we went in the parlor, you could see the digital dermatitis. So we implemented some foot bathing, but they didn't sustain the foot bathing. So we saw a rise again in the cows likely to benefit from treatment. I came back to the farm around this point here, and I said, what had you done in terms of getting cows through the crush, through the trim chute? And this farmer had been focused on the very lame cows, what we call the score 3s, but not the score twos. So with the farmer's agreement, we put a lot of the score twos through the crush, and thankfully, we saw a very quick improvement, a response to our treatment. And so straight away, we got some feedback to say we were onto the right things with the early detection prompt effective treatment, because once we treated them, a lot of them were improving. But there were a group of cows that weren't improving, and these were perhaps the cows that were chronically lame. They had already had previous damage, and we had to just try and nurse them along. And so that was what happened in this period here. Actually, the scorer went on holiday for a little while, had a few weeks off, and then restarted scoring. The cows were out at grass as well at this point in time, out at pasture. They came in, boom. Cows didn't like the cubicles. They rejected the cubicles. They were bruising their feet, but we were able to see this. We were able to respond. We adjusted cubicles, moved neck rails, really went to town on the cubicle comfort, and we saw an initial response, but we're higher. So we were having to work quite hard here, and you know, I was feeling a bit frustrated. It looked like things had got worse. I was then experimenting a little bit with some automated lameness detection systems which weren't really working, so we reinstated human scoring and got back onto managing trim lists. The foot baths stopped working, foot baths reinstated, foot baths stopped working, foot baths reinstated, and we started to learn some of the things that were key to making progress on this farm. By this point here, we felt like we were really made a huge impact. We got down to 16% of cows that were likely to benefit from treatment. But notice what happened to the very lame. They were at 5 to 10% here, and this dropped away down to just below 1% by the end of this study. Important to say, they didn't do this through culling. They were 22% replacement rate herd throughout this study. And it's an illustration of the sorts of things you can learn by gathering some data and managing this early detection prompt effective treatment proactively. To highlight how this herd changed from being a chronically lame herd to a herd responding more to the new cases, this is a plot to show the cows that were repeatedly score 2 or 3, repeatedly lame according to our definition. These are the new cases. So the new cases remained, you know, they were sort of diminished a little bit, but you know, by treating them quickly, we shortened the duration of lameness, and they recovered more effectively, and few of them became chronically lame. And so you can see the recovery rates remained about the same, but our speed with which we got to those cows was the key factor to reducing the number that were chronically lame. And so let's have another look at how the cows are walking. So, you know, when I look at this, it just really leaps out at me. But for most farmers, you know, looking at their own cows, they would say that, you know, that there's not too much wrong with that one. I'll play it again for you. But I always think, as trimmers, you are very sensitive to watching what the feet are doing and identifying which limb or limbs need treatment. So how many of you in the room would agree that she is a cow that's likely to benefit from treatment? Let's show of hands. Okay. So what's really interesting is when we, and I run these workshops pretty much every month with groups of farmers. So the host farmer would generally say, well, I think she's all right. And then the visiting farmers, always have to prepare the host farmers for this. All of the visiting farmers would say, no, she needs treating. And it seems to be a bit of a phenomenon that I see when I'm working with groups of farmers, is that you know, when a farmer is visiting another farm, they can be quite brutal. So if you're doing training, then just be aware of that one. So what do you expect when you pick up these early stage mobility score cows that are that we think are likely to benefit from treatment. Well, the picture can be quite different and can be quite frustrating. So a lot of the trimmers that I've worked with over the years say, initially they pick up the feet and they say, well, there's not much here. And sometimes you have to keep looking. And it's a really different mindset, because you have to be using hoof testers. And we did a lot of work showing you yesterday. You can squeeze as hard as you like with hoof testers. You're never going to exceed the force with which the cow puts a foot through. You also have to inspect quite carefully sometimes between the claws, because sometimes it will be an early lesion in between the claws. And so having these tools are quite key to doing it. But sometimes you just do a trim and the cow will improve just by improving the biomechanics, the shape of the foot. And I think you've got to prepare yourself for actually the fact that a lot of them will just benefit from just a routine trim. But I like to use the hoof testers very proactively. Sometimes you will miss something with hoof testers. If you see a cow walk out and you're still not happy, I'll bring her back in, or see her again the following week. But prepare yourself for the fact you are not going to be, if you are successful with this, you will catch sole ulcers at a sole bruising stage. And if you're really early with your sole bruising, you will not see the hemorrhage on the bottom of the sole. That's the key thing to remind yourself. You will not always see the hemorrhage on the bottom of the sole if you have caught that lesion early enough. Are there other ways to catch cows with an early stage lesion? And of course there are. And this is a farm I was working with, this farm actually at the start of the week. And we hose off the feet in the parlour on a monthly basis just to check for digital dermatitis. The parlour had stopped at this point, so there was a bit of dunging. And you can see the feet are a little bit dirty, but you can see the heels quite clearly, and you can see that no sign of digital dermatitis in any of these cows. So I like to do this sort of screening, and then any cows that we think have a digital dermatitis lesion, then we'll flag them up for treatment. But it's not just digital dermatitis that we can look for. And I think technology is really coming on leaps and bounds. And this is some really exciting technology that I've been working with Hoof Count, where it's a camera on the end of the foot bath that allows you to get a perfect view of the cow's foot as she's walking. The initial stage of this project was a proof of concept to see if cameras can detect digital dermatitis in an automated way, and we were able to demonstrate that the predictive algorithms can spot digital dermatitis. But what really excited me was the potential to spot other things. So see this cow here. Look at this foot landing here. Do you think this cow could benefit from a foot trim? What do you think? Yes. I just couldn't believe it when I saw this. I got so excited. This can be game-changing, couldn't it? And is this likely to pick out cows before they go lame? I think so. But early days. So before we get to this stage, we probably still have a lot of work to do with just improving the lameness detection on farm. And of course, there are other technologies out there. Cattle Eye are a sponsor of this, this conference, and they're doing some excellent work with Liverpool University, showing actually the cameras can detect the behavioral changes of lameness that human scorers can do, and would perform as well, if not slightly better in certain circumstances than the human scorers. So technology in all of this can be game-changing. But I do come back to the fact that this technology is not going to be a replacement for having people with the skills to identify lame cows. And I keep coming back to lots of case studies where we've implemented good screening protocols combined with good trimming protocols, and we've got to give ourselves time, because this instance, I'm lucky that I still work with this farm, because we had a roller coaster ride to start with, and then we got everything right at this point here, and then everything seemed to improve. In fact, this farm carries on to improving, and I've been working with this one now for 9 years, and it's about as good as it can get. And I'm going to reinforce this message that Gerard said, the use of anti-inflammatories is quite key. We did a study where we showed the combination of the trim plus block plus anti-inflammatory with early lameness cases was the most effective treatment for restoring cows back to soundness. Our score 0 was soundness. But the likely biggest beneficiaries are always going to be our younger animals. So our first lactation animals are the ones that will benefit most from the proactive use of anti-inflammatories. So I'm a big proponent of the use of anti-inflammatories for early lameness. But if we delay detection by just 2 weeks, we lose pretty much all of that benefit. And what we found in this follow-up study was actually cows were going lame on other legs. They were developing lesions in the other legs. So by delaying our detection, we are allowing problems in other limbs to develop. So give yourself time. If you're monitoring this data, don't expect results overnight. It's often what we do with our heifers that will give us benefit in second, third, fourth lactation. And that's what gathering this data will help confirm. And then the last message is, this isn't to replace prevention. The early detection, prompt effective treatment goes alongside the prevention. I don't know a farm that has just solely treated or trimmed their way out of a problem. The trimming data informs us as to which priorities to go at on farm. So if it's a sole ulcer problem, then maybe we're going to be focused on the forces on the feet, the time budgets, the cow comfort. If it's white line, it might be cow flow and cow walkways. If it's digital dermatitis, then it might be low infection pressure. But it's a bit like, are you going to have lunch or breakfast? And in my world, I like to have both. And I think the same goes for treatment and prevention. So, key messages. Mobility scoring is one way in which we can gather some early screening data and motivate and get around this emotiveness of the word lameness. Finding new cases, it's spotting the new cases helps us prevent the chronic cases. But a lot of that requires training on farm, and I think we've all got the skills and the insights to develop that training on farm to improve that detection. And this early detection, prompt effective treatment requires the focus to all the parts of that phrase. The early detection through the screening, the promptness of getting the cow into the foot crush for treatment, that's got to happen every day, and then the effective treatment, the use of blocks, anti-inflammatories, and other treatments. So we really need to get all of those parts of the equation right. So with that, I'll say thank you. This is my acknowledgement. None of my sponsors are on here. These are all initiatives and colleagues and collaborators that I work with in the UK and internationally. So with that, I'll say thank you to you all for listening, and I'll welcome any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ANKA, for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to be here remotely, unfortunately, due to the political and immigration situation in the US, but, well, hopefully things will improve soon, and I'll get to see you sometime soon. So thank you for the invite. And it's pretty early here, so I'm already on like my third coffee. We'll see how this goes, and I'm going to try to go slow for the translators as well. So thank you very much. I'll be talking about foot baths, all things foot baths and beyond, and some other strategies that we can have for preventing and controlling digital dermatitis. Daniel already introduced me, but just again, my name Laura Solano. I'm from Costa Rica. I'm a veterinarian from Costa Rica, and I spent I was crazy enough to move and leave that beautiful country and go to the cold weather of Canada and spend there 13 years doing my PhD and then some consulting work and with the industry working on all things lameness, hoof lesions, digital dermatitis, foot bathing, and animal care overall. And recently, about a year ago, I moved here to Wisconsin, Madison to start my position at the University of Wisconsin. And I work with probably people that you've heard quite a bit of. So my colleagues would be Nigel Cook and Dr. Dorte Zopfer, which some of the material they kindly passed on. So with that, I guess I'll just jump in. We're going to be talking very briefly about digital dermatitis, a very quick overview of that, jumping into the foot bathing monitoring and insights and some other complementary strategies for prevention. So to start with, we just a very brief overview, recognizing that digital dermatitis, where I'm going to be referring to it as DD, is an infectious, contagious, and primarily bacterial hoof lesion, trichoniums being the main agent involved, either on making the onset or triggering and making it last. Establish the hoof lesion, but they need a way of entry. So microlacerations and wet hooves, that combination and skin breakage kind of opens up an entry for the bacteria to invade. And that's kind of how it goes deep down in the layers. It starts invading the skin and the epidermal layers of the skin deep down and kind of changing the morphology and the shape of the bacteria as it goes deep down in the layers of the skin. And we think that they do that through kind of like progressing through hair follicles as well. And the deeper in the layers they get, the changes, we can see kind of like the clinical changes in the lesions as well. And that's why we have several presentations of digital dermatitis. We can call it mortellera, I guess. Harry Hillwords in Europe is more common, that name, but we're all talking about the same lesions. So we get to see a variety of stages, the most common classification system being M0, M1, 2, 3, 4, and M4.1 from this classification system from Dr. Dorte Zopfer. And this really characterizes because it's very, very dynamic. The stages can jump from one stage to the other within days. And probably we've been investigating and studying this lesion for a long time already, and we still see prevalence levels that are extremely high. 20% of cows are usually with an active stage of DD, active being M2 or an M4.1, and from 40 to 60% of cows with any digital at any point in time given, they present some stage of digital dermatitis. So it's been several years, many years of studying this bacterial lesion, and we still find very high prevalences of it. And then the cost associated with it has to do quite a bit also with the prevalence and the levels of prevalence that it has. Some recent studies from France and Spain actually calculated a single case of severe digital dermatitis to be almost up to 400 euros. So it's very prevalent and still very expensive, costing quite a bit of issues around. So how do we go around this? A lot of what we do is focusing on the prevention of active stages. So what we want to do is when we have an active stage, we do a topical treatment, and that active stage goes into a chronic stage. And if things go right and we have a preventive system with a foot bathing and hygiene, then that chronic lesion should not go into active. And that is the aim of a foot bath, to prevent chronic lesions going back into active lesions and kind of triggering again that cycle and that dynamics of the different stages. So the foot bath really is meant to be to prevent and stop this cycle from going into active stages and getting spreading the infection to all of the cows. So that's done not just by any foot bath. It really has to be an effective footpath. And when we talk about food bathing, there is just a variety and a lot of things that we need to look at. So a way that I thought that we could think about it to